Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a massive, millennia-old question. This explainer is actually a companion piece inspired by episode 230 of the 5-Minute Debate, where host Robert Smith moderated this rapid-fire clash between two incredibly different ways to look at the origin of humanity. The whole core tension we're looking at today boils down to this. Did Adam's sin break a perfectly immortal world and introduce all biological death? Or did his fall have a much more specific, localized consequence? I mean, it's a question that just naturally hooks your curiosity, right? Did death exist before Adam? On one side of the debate, we've got the traditional reading of Genesis that says, absolutely not, no way. But then on the other side, we have voices arguing that actually biological death was already a completely natural part of the world outside the Garden of Eden. And honestly, what's so fascinating to me is how these ancient texts are right now intersecting with modern cutting-edge genetic science. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, the origin of death, mapping the debate. Which brings us to part 2, the traditional viewpoint, a perfect creation broken. To really grasp what's at stake here, we kind of have to start with the perspective that serves as the absolute foundation for the traditional reading of Genesis. In this view, God creates a picture of sheer perfection. We're talking a universe that is flawless, completely devoid of decay, and totally devoid of death. And the cornerstone of this traditional argument? It's found right here in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 12. It reads, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin." So one side of our debate argues that this single verse proves Adam's sin was the absolute catalyst for all physical death entering the universe. Before this moment, literally nothing died. Not humans, not animals, not even the microscopic organisms in the dirt. So let's break down the core tenets of this viewpoint. First up, we have that picture of absolute perfection. Second, no death existed before sin, not even in the animal kingdom. Everything was essentially vegetarian. Third, Adam's sin brought the actual mechanism of biological death into the physical world. And fourth, and this is a major theological pillar here, moral guilt is transmitted to all of humanity because of Adam's action. Everyone inherits Adam's guilt simply by being born. Now, let's shift gears for part 3, a closer look at Scripture, the textual pivot. So the opposing side in the 5-minute debate pushes back really hard on that first interpretation. What's absolutely fascinating is the original Greek text of Romans 5:12. When you look at the raw language, the text specifically says death spread to men, meaning humankind. Notice it says absolutely nothing about animals, plants, or microbes. The alternate view basically argues that you have to artificially read animal death into the text just to promote a specific view of a perfectly immortal natural world. This alternate view summarizes it beautifully like this. Death is what spread to all men, all humans. Not guilt, death. The text says death. This perspective argues that Romans 5:12 is strictly about the transmission of mortality to humans, not the transmission of moral guilt. See, when Adam and Eve sinned, they were driven from the garden, right? They were cut off from the source of life, the presence of God. Because they lost access to Eden, they lost what we call conditional immortality. They began to age, and eventually, they died. Let's put these two ideas side by side so we can clearly see the distinction. Under the traditional view, Adam essentially invented biological death, and he passes down his moral guilt to you and me. But under the alternate view, Adam's punishment was losing his conditional immortality when he was expelled from Eden. Death already existed out there in the wider world, but Adam and Eve were protected from it inside the garden. Now, why does this matter? Well, think about it. If biological death already existed outside the garden, it opens up this totally fascinating pathway to reconcile these ancient texts with modern evolutionary science. Which perfectly sets up part 4, genetic versus genealogical ancestry, finding a synthesis. And this brings us to a really groundbreaking synthesis that was introduced during the debate, Dr. Joshua Swaminathan's genealogical Adam and Eve model. Dr. Swaminathan is an MD, a PhD research scientist, and a computational biologist, and he offers this truly mind-bending thought experiment to reconcile this theological debate with statistical genetics. The crucial point we have to understand here is the difference between genetic ancestry and genealogical ancestry. Genetic ancestry traces the actual inheritance of DNA material. Genealogical ancestry, on the other hand, traces the physical chain of descent, basically your family tree. Just think about your own family for a second. You are genealogically related to everyone in your family tree, but you definitely don't carry the DNA of every single ancestor. And that leads us to an incredible scientific reality that Dr. Swaminathan calls genetic ghosts. If you go far enough back in time, the vast majority of your ancestors pass down exactly 0 DNA to you. None. They are genetic ghosts. DNA evidence is kind of like a street lamp on a dark road. It only illuminates a very small, specific area of the past. Because of this, it is scientifically entirely possible that a historical Adam and Eve could be our universal genealogical ancestors without leaving a single trace in our modern DNA. Crazy, right? Let's pull this all together in Part 5, Reconciling Science and Theology, the two stories. So if Adam and Eve can be our genealogical ancestors without conflicting with genetics, how do the scientific and biblical narratives actually fit together? Well, here is how Dr. Swamitdas's model works step by step. Step 1. Biological evolution and common descent are occurring outside the Garden of Eden. Biological death is happening out there, it's just a part of nature. Step 2, God specially creates Adam and Eve, literally de novo, without parents, inside the garden less than 10,000 years ago. Then, step 3, after the fall, Adam and Eve lose their conditional immortality. They have to leave the garden, and their offspring intermingle with the biologically identical human populations that were already living outside. Within just a few thousand years, well before the 1st century AD, Adam and Eve's lineage would have spread to become the genealogical ancestors of everyone across the globe. I just love how this brilliantly illustrates that we don't necessarily have to choose between science and scripture. In this model, they're really just telling two different stories about the exact same physical world. Science is telling the story of genetic ancestry and human evolution outside the garden. Scripture is telling the story of genealogical ancestry, the theological history of Adam and Eve and their descendants. They absolutely do not cancel each other out. Both can be simultaneously true. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If science and scripture are really just two different lenses, one looking at genetics, the other at genealogy, looking at the exact same history, how does this change your reading of Genesis? Does it change how you view the consequences of Adam's fall? I really hope this explainer sparked some serious curiosity for you and gave you a totally fresh way to visualize these complex ideas from the debate. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and keep exploring.